Good. Well, welcome all. Welcome. We're very excited to have Henry Shukman on this Pacific Zen Luminary series. Henry has so many subterranean ties to, and we have so many subterranean ties to him, in that for many years I knew and practiced with both Joan Rieck and Ruben Habito, two of his teachers in Japan, with Yamada Koun, and also I know Yamada Roshi, who's another one of his teachers, and then we have so many friends in common, Pico Iyer and David Hinton, I think maybe on this call. So he's like a Dharma cousin to us, and I'm just thrilled to have him on. I think, Henry, what I'd like to do is just start off with, if it's okay, with a quote from your One Blade of Grass. We'll be touching on the two books, the One Blade of Grass, which was I think about 5 years ago, and then just a year ago, Original Love. And to me, the One Blade of Grass, there's a lot of awakening in this. There's a lot of emptiness, and so to me, this of the two represents emptiness. And then Henry, in Original Love, he's trying to develop a system where he can bring that emptiness, I think, to the Sangha, and that's the form part of his teaching, how I see it. But let me just read this. All I had really wanted all along was to be taught to love this world, and now I had. Even if there were another better world, I didn't want it. Zen opened an unknown wellspring that gushed like the watchfire of love, the Roman candle in the heart I had first tasted many years ago on the beach in South America, a fount of love that never ceased welling up. As Juan de la Cruz said in the 16th century, how well I know that fountain which gushes and flows, though it be in the dark of night. So, welcome, Henry.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that interesting, kind, and generous introduction, and thank you for having me on. I'm really happy to be with you. I've been a big admirer of this series and of Pacific Zen Institute more generally. You know, you've produced out of Pacific Zen, some fantastic books have come. You know, particularly, of course, from John Tarrant. You know. That have been really, really helpful and deeply enjoyable for me and so it's lovely to be with you. And those subterranean mycelial networks, root networks that we share are quite a delight. And what's that koan with Yento and Shui Feng? You know, we're born on the same stem, but don't die on the same stem.
Yeah, that's great. Well, maybe we can get some sense of your first book, your biography. Like, where did you grow up, and what was going on in your childhood?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Oxford, England. You know, both my parents were academics, and it was an extremely culturally rich upbringing. You know, I was plunged into languages. I mean, at the age of 7, we started French. 8, we started Latin. 9, we started Greek. All the way through, you know, and then actually I took up Russian when I was 13. Bit of German was thrown in, and so it was a very sort of literary, linguistic, and culturally rich education that I was, you know, blessed to have. And I think you know, there's a lot to be said for learning languages as a kid, and I'm not that I appreciated it at the time. You know, it's like a drag to be heaving dictionaries around and having to pore through them. But it was also a fantastic. I mean, Oxford is an incredibly beautiful city, you know, and it was just even at the time I loved it. You know, I learned to love it, and the old stone buildings and the alleyways and the medieval center, and and the fields all around and the beautiful college gardens. And as kids of academics, I say we because there was a great friend of mine, a fellow poet actually, we would kind of scamper around all these back alleys and into the gardens. We assumed we were allowed to, as we were, our parents were part of the university. Never absolutely 100% clear, but we did it anyway. And we got to know, I don't know, secret courtyards and rooftops as well. We loved rooftops. When we could get on a rooftop, we did, and there's all the little channels of water, the canal, the river, 2 rivers at Oxford, and little channels that run among the buildings and so on. It's a very magical upbringing. Actually, it was also riven with suffering for me because I had a terrible skin affliction from an early age, from the age of 6 months, that I was always trying to kind of outrun and ignore, but couldn't really because it was very painful and very itchy, and I was hospitalized at times with it. And so it was kind of a mixed bag, I had, and then my parents had a very difficult love triangle that they were caught in, which led to divorce. And it was very complicated, both the divorce and the breaking up of our home, and the years after also were difficult. So I had, I was kind of looking for, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on quite a lot.
Oh, that's just fine. No, we love stories.
You better stop me. Basically, I think one of the reasons I kind of really fell in love with poetry in my early teens was that it gave me something, another avenue, another thing that I could really give myself to that was not caught up in the home I'd grown up in, and that I could sort of forget my rather, torturous skin by getting into. And it also provided a way of sort of speaking about, articulating, or actually more than that, really carrying a kind of energy from what I was loving about the world. Even what I was talking about with Oxford, I wrote early sort of hymns to Oxford, paeans to Oxford that just sort of, and when they came through, they'd articulate, they'd express what I'd been feeling, but in a much, allowing me to feel it all the more vividly. And so it was a sort of, I realized that poetry could be, I discovered rather that it could be this way of connecting with the world in a totally different way, of being intimately sort of lived by the world and having somehow the world express itself through me as the poet. And it was absolutely thrilling to get to know that was a possibility.
Yeah. And your skin affliction was really, really severe, and you talk about it a little bit in Original Love, but I can't help but think that may have had an influence on how you worked on koans, on your practice, because your body didn't have to tell you, or your mind didn't have to tell your body how to embody something, right? Your body was already highly sensitized to, I don't know, receiving koans perhaps, or meditation or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I've wondered about that. And I think there was definitely something about pretty unbearable, itching and burning and pain that really there wasn't any escape from, and how to just be with that. Somehow a lot of the time I was fraught with great distress, but I would sometimes find strange pockets of peace in the midst of it, really profound, intense peace that actually I think were jhana states. When I did a jhana training over a couple of years recently, in fact, over 2, 3, 4 years ago, I was just curious to know about them. But when I started popping into the jhana states, which are, I'm not sure how much any of you know about that, but it's a very interesting system. I think a little bit, it's a bit of a sideshow compared to what koans can do, but it's a very interesting one. And they, I think I was going into jhana states as a kid spontaneously, um, and finding, a kind of strange mutation of the suffering into something totally fine and very not just bearable but even pleasant.
Interesting. So you graduated from high school and you took 6 months off to Argentina and working outside, and the affliction went away.
Yeah. I mean, there might be a mundane explanation in terms of diet, maybe a little bit. It's possible, but I mean, for sure, the way they put it is that the medics is that eczema has a multifactorial etiology, meaning they don't know what factors really cause it, but it could for sure. I mean, stress is part of it, and now it was a very stressful home. My single mum was brilliant but very troubled herself, and and it was a difficult situation because I don't need to go into the details now, but I do in the book somewhat. But it was a difficult situation for them, my parents, and they didn't talk about it. There was a kind of English silence around it, and which just made it all the more palpable how much that silence was holding. And in some ways, I mean, I think both my brother and sister found it very hard as well, but I seemed to carry it even a bit more as a little bit of a black sheep in the family, um, and so I think when I got away for the first time at the age of 18 and 19 for those 6 months away, for sure there was an extraordinary kind of sense of it being possible to actually experience this thing called being happy, that I hadn't known wasn't happening, until then, really, how much I'd carried of a kind of burden of family shame was in there, and just this sort of, there's some unspoken secret about our family that we can't talk about, and there's a lot of unhappiness that we can't talk about. But when I got away, definitely I was actually also with a friend, all that time, who was just a much more sort of robust and healthy minded individual than I had been, and it just to start discovering that, wow, what it could be to not be carrying a sort of sense of responsibility for my mum's emotional well-being, for example. It was fantastic to be shedding what my nervous system had been carrying of her nervous system, I think.
Yeah. And then, so you finish a novel and you're ready to go home. You go to a beach, and you had an experience which you've written about quite a bit. Could you share with us just briefly that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those moments. It was I was staring at the light on the ocean as the sun was setting, and I was just asking myself the question, what was I really seeing? Because it was dazzlingly bright, and yet I could see that really there were these scales of light. I'm going into some detail here. I hope that's okay. But there were these scales of very bright light moving over the water. But as they moved, when one moved off a patch of water, that patch was utterly black, utterly matte black, no light at all. And I was suddenly, well, wait a minute, is the water bright or is the water totally, totally, utterly dark? And then I thought, but water's kind of transparent, and so is air. And what I'm seeing is just the surface where the water and the air are meeting. And it's just light, which is invisible in and of itself. It just shows objects. And suddenly the me that was seeing all of that just somehow dropped away. And there was just actually what happened really was that I dropped into a kind of what felt like another I don't know how to explain it. I'm tempted to say dimension or something, but it was as if there was a single fabric that was what everything was. But that fabric was basically insubstantial. It wasn't really a fabric. And that's what I was. So I felt that the tip of my nose was pressing against the beginning of the universe, and that the tips of my fingers were touching the end of the universe. And that, the beginning of time was here and the end of time was here. And that's what I really was. And of course, it sort of it faded, or it passed like as if a beam of truth had sort of found me and shone at me. And then it did sort of pass. And then I was again a person standing on a beach, and there was a sunset, and I kind of knew that I belonged in a way that belonging was not a strong enough word for it. I was just absolutely made of whatever the universe is, and there was no distinction between me and the universe. And actually, belonging had been a kind of issue in my life, because I had this terrible skin thing that really sort of separated me from the world, and it also put up a little bit of a barrier between me and my peers in some way. I felt, because it's unsightly, and I felt somewhat sort of ashamed of it. And then actually being half Jewish in England at that time, there was sort of subtle anti-Semitism, not you couldn't possibly call it any sort of oppression, because my dad had a very great position at a college or the university and stuff, but there was still sort of, it was okay to make the odd sort of unkind joke about Jews and stuff, and not in a particularly jovial way. There was a sort of, really a little bit sort of, you're not one of us thing. And I wasn't brought up Jewish at all, so I didn't feel very Jewish anyway. But it was, so there was, belonging was a kind of issue for me. I didn't really belong in England exactly, because but I didn't really belong with the Jews either. We weren't brought up that way. And our family's broken anyway in two homes. Which one do I really belong in? And then suddenly this experience happened where it was just unmistakable that I could not belong more in any way to anything. It was there was an absolute belonging, and it wasn't even a matter of I belong in the world. It was sort of beyond that. There's only belonging, kind of thing. So it was a really wonderful thing to stumble into, however that happened. And I felt basically I'd found that everything was just this vast, timeless love or something. I don't know what it was, and I remember for several days after, I was just quivering with kind of, with sort of love and a lot of compassion. I remember feeling moved to try to help with street kids in the town of Guayaquil, which was nearby, and do what I could, and just very sort of lightweight. I felt like I was very sort of light. That was not to say that the intensity of the experience was still going on, but this sort of, the after effects of it really stayed with me. It was very open and full of love. And then finally, a few weeks later, I went back to England. It was right at the end of this trip. And actually, within half an hour of walking into my dad's house, I started itching again. And, the eczema started coming back. And I was suddenly overwhelmed by the unhappiness that had been part of my childhood that I'd never really felt. I tried very hard not to feel it, while growing up, because I wanted to function and be okay. But when I got home, I was so open that it really overwhelmed me, and I had a very hard time actually for a few years. Sort of,
Mm.
I mean, yeah, I was functional, but it was difficult.
But did that sort of get you on the road to meditation through like TM or?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. In a bit, yeah. I sort of got by the best I could, and then yeah, I think I was 24 when a couple of friends persuaded me reluctantly to start TM, and they had a very good. It's quite expensive, and they had a very good deal for graduate students, which I was at the time, and the combination of the bargain basement price that they're offering for a week, plus the encouragement or pressure of these two friends, one of whom was much older, in her 80s, and one was my age. But they both meditated, and they both spoke very highly of the possible benefits. So I did. I took it up, and actually, it was the best thing I could have done. It really was the beginning of a path, of not just of healing, which I badly needed, but also of beginning to reapproach what on earth had that wondrous thing been that had happened on the beach, and how might one, was there possibly, because I mean, I had no framework for it. I just knew I'd sort of somehow seen something that than which nothing could be more true, but I didn't know how or what. And actually, I didn't really find the answers in TM, but I was starting to get better enough that I could start thinking about that again. And my gosh, what was that? What do we do about it? Because it's not right to ignore it, and I luckily, I was beginning a career as a writer. That book that I'd written back then got published, and I did another one, and then I came out to New Mexico to write about D.H. Lawrence, who lived out here for a bit. And while I was here, I got exposed to Dogen and Zen, and I just felt intuitively that he knew whatever that mysterious, marvelous thing had been. He knew. And
Henry, I neglected to ask you to read this before. I didn't give you the reading. Can I read the quote from Dogen that you? And I'm really interested in your thoughts at that time. What did you feel? And now, how do you look at it? Mountains do not lack the qualities of mountains. Therefore, they always abide in ease and always walk. You should examine in detail this quality of the mountains walking. Mountains walking is just like human walking. Accordingly, do not doubt mountains walking, even though it does not look the same as human walking.
yes, it
That's
was that
great.
passage. Yeah, yeah. I didn't understand a word of it, um, but it wouldn't leave me alone. And it was actually 2 or 3 days later. I remember quite distinctly. I was washing a mug at the sink in the friend's house where I was renting a room, actually, and I just suddenly got this jolt through my body that whatever all of that you just read, John, whatever all of that meant, it would make sense in the context of what I'd experienced many years by then, 8, 9 years before on that beach. It would make sense somehow. And I couldn't exactly articulate why, but I just felt that those words are coming from that experience.
Yeah.
And I really couldn't have explained why. It was just a strong intuition. And the next day I went and got trained in Zazen, actually, here in Santa Fe, up at the where Upaya is, there's a wonderful old temple called Seragordo Temple that was built in the 70s, which has a Tibetan stupa and a little, absolutely lovely little zendo, and there were some refugees from San Francisco Zen Center who'd come to Santa Fe with Richard Baker Roshi after the debacle. And one of them, it was a lovely guy called Robert Winsome, and who actually died quite young, sadly, a few years later. But he took me into that little room, and this bare, simple room, black cushions, black mats, one candle, very, very simple, and he just sat me down and taught me the posture, told me to count my breath for 15 minutes, and I was hooked. I was hooked, and I guess I was prepared. I'd done 5 years of TM by then, daily, twice a day, very diligently. But as soon as I tasted Zazen, it was like, oh my gosh, this is about being alive, and that's what I wanted,
And you, I think it was then. Did you start your sort of angya to search for a teacher, or the universe had you searching for a teacher all the way to New York and England? And
yeah, I didn't really get that I needed a teacher. I got that I'd like to have a regular place to sit, but I was, I'm not. I think I've got over it now, but I wasn't very good at joining things. I'd been a solitary writer. I mean, with good friendships and stuff, but I didn't really want to join a group. So I'd go to these. I went to various different Zen centers. Yeah, in upstate New York, of course, Zen Mountain Monastery. That I went several times there to do sesshin. I did a session up on the mountains in New Mexico with a teacher called George Bowman, who I think was basically out of the Sung San tradition, I think, and that was fantastic. Hell for the first 4 days, and then marvelous, And actually, I had another kind of glimpse, really, while I was on that retreat, of suddenly discovering that there wasn't anybody on board, the way I thought, but I bounced around. I had a pretty peripatetic life anyway. I was writing for different magazines, and I really enjoyed moving, and I was in back and forth New Mexico, sometimes London, sometimes New York. Staying with friends or getting a short sublet when I needed it, and working on my books. And it was only after about 10 years of that when I had a fellowship in Oxford, actually, and that brought us back there. And there was a Zen center in Oxford, and I'd been there a couple of times over the years when Sister Elaine McInnes was there.
no, sister, yeah, she died in 22, I think, but knew her very
Yes.
well.
And you must have known her in Kamakura.
Oh yes,
yeah. Right, marvelous. But I still hadn't really twigged what a teacher could do for my practice. But there was a new teacher there, and I started going and meeting with him, Jon Gaynor, he's called, and that was a revelation, because I suddenly discovered, wow, what it could be to really connect and receive and sort of be open to something. In me was ripe and ready, I guess, and I was just ready to receive guidance. And I think maybe it's partly that he happened to be an English man, and he didn't wear robes. He was very ordinary in that sense. It was very Sanbo Zen in the West is quite low on Zen protocols and that. I think that probably helps a bit, but I just felt this was a natural thing that just developed, and there was no decision, like, really, I must decide to study with this person or something. It just started happening, I realized that I was very lucky, and it was a real blessing because he had a lot to teach, and I was ready to receive it. And that's actually when I really started on. Well, I started with Mu, and then had a totally unexpected kind of breakthrough experience with Mu that was outside anything I would have known sitting with a little sound like Mu could possibly trigger. Had no. I didn't even connect that experience with sitting with Mu, actually. He had to point that out to me. So, well, might I remind you, you've been sitting with Mu for quite a while. This is not unrelated. And then I started working with those Mu questions and so on. So that really got me on the koan track. And yeah, I think it was a very blessed, fortunate thing in my case to find that path, that particular path.
And then you somehow you got back to Santa Fe.
Yeah, well, I had two fellowships. I had this fellowship in Oxford at Oxford Brookes University in poetry for a couple of years, and then one at the Lake District, actually, at Wordsworth's old place where Wordsworth and Coleridge lived. I was the poet in residence up there for a year, and so that was a very rich time. I also, my first poetry collection came out right around then, or just before then, so I was deep in the sort of the British poetry scene for a bit. But we had always planned to come back to Santa Fe, and we came back out here after a bit, and that's when I started training with Joan Rieck, who you mentioned earlier. Yeah.
I in reading your autobiography, I'm just impressed by all of the guides who have helped you, starting with your childhood. Speedy, I guess, was the local woodsman, and then there was a priest. I want to say Gaston, but that's not it. But and then you kept meeting people along the way, helping you, Flora and Linda, and many people, and it's just it's kind of an amazing thing, how that happens for us when we're searching, when we're available, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think there was a certain point when I realized that I was basically trying to write a great big thank you letter to all these people who had helped me. And that's actually what the book really was, which I had not realized until quite far on in the process, that it is really sort of a litany of thanks to the blessings of these different mentors and guides, and sort of sometimes just a nudger, just a little swivel this way, try this way, and sometimes a long period of deep training,
Yeah.
And something in me was, because I was quite a rebellious and resistant sort of chap. Especially as a young man, I didn't really respect teachers, actually. I mean, even at school, I sort of a bit at college, but I was very, I think, probably, I mean, psychologically, probably the difficulties with my dad, and I was angry at men, I think, really angry at men older than me. And so it took quite a time to really, somehow I was prepared, I was open to receiving pointers along the way, but I think not to that deeper relationship of sort of instruction, or at least with strong reservations. But then there came this point when I could really open up to it,
Yeah. Another thing I'm really interested with you is, you got into your koan study and you had other experiences, and you're opening up more, and it's sort of the other side of the mountain, right? So we go up to the peak, and then we have the other side of the mountain. And your spontaneous experience, it was, the other side was not that easy, and I think it's really important for people to know, what's that other side of the mountain like. Sometimes it's smooth and easy walking, and sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember hearing Daido Lori Roshi saying, we can get you up the mountain, but it's harder actually to get you back down the mountain. And that's a harder journey. And I remember there was a guy here in town in Santa Fe who was a Roshi trained by Genpo Roshi, right, for that Genpo line. And I remember hearing him say, first, we turn earth to gold, and then we got to turn gold back into earth, and that's harder, or something like that. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think the learning to live it, to actually live it, and even Koun Roshi, I think we used to say, you got to wash it away. You got to wash it away, and then you got to wash away the fact that you washed it away. Somehow just really coming back to this very moment as it is, and there's nothing missing, there's nothing lacking, there's nothing wanting, there's nothing. It's just this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems like Original Love as a book is sort of your attempt to do that, to help people, go up the mountain and come down the mountain. What you were telling us earlier about how the genesis of Original Love, how did you begin to write that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, it was I think there was once COVID hit, and we could no longer meet in person at the Zendo. And I also happened to have a bike accident around that time as well that made it difficult to do Dokusan uh, either in person or online. And I had to find a new way of teaching. And I realized that I'd been wanting to, I'd already been teaching much more than just koans, actually. I'd been trying to convey a broader approach to what meditation can be, because really I found more and more that, much as I loved the koan path that I'd been led on, I was very, committed to it and really, sincerely greatly helped by it. But actually, I began to feel like it's not for everybody, and not everybody has awakenings and openings, but they have very valuable other shifts. They're just not into, whether we want to call it emptiness or the non-dual or something. They're not into that, but there's so many other things that can happen in the course of a life of practice. And I just didn't want to be emphasizing only the kensho and the awakening, because as we know, they're unpredictable, and I'd seen students who'd been sitting with Mu for 25 years, and really nothing. They hadn't had the breakthrough, and but they'd learned a lot of other things through that practice. But I think to call out those other dimensions of growth through regular meditation just became really important to me. So the book Original Love is an attempt to lay out what I thought and still sort of think of some primary dimensions of growth and development and of opening that aren't one of which is the non-dual, but the other three are, I think I'd have to say, just as valuable. And I have, there's a metaphor that's sort of in behind the book, which is from this early Chinese Buddhist teacher. I think he was called Sencho, who said that practice is like a cart track with two wheel ruts, and one of those ruts, is principle or realization, awakening, but the other rut is the foundations of mindfulness, a gradual path of development. And I sort of break that second rut down into these three territories, which are, mindfulness for sure, but also support and connectedness, and also absorption, samadhi, flow states, and sort of teasing out more what can happen in those. I think is really I feel still it's very important, and not just because not everybody gets the big awakening, but also because even those that do need the other stuff as well. I think, and so I think a balanced practice, a wholesome path, more integrated path of practice, I feel is I really cherish it.
In a sense, I guess that's what you didn't have when you were 19. You didn't have a vessel to hold it. Huh?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, should we just touch on those three things: mindfulness and support? And one thing, I mindfulness is pretty straightforward. I think support. There's a lot of richness in that category, right? Because you talk about support as being everything from the arts to sports to whatever it takes. And one thing that really grabbed me was Ilian McGilchrist, some of his work, and it was really interesting because poetry is so important to us, and we actually use poetry as a koan almost every morning. We sit with a koan for the week, but then the moderators give almost a capping phrase of a poem, and so we're flooded with koans and poetry all the time. But McGilchrist had a really interesting thing to say about mythos and logos, and about studying poetry in schools.
Yes, that's right. I don't know if folks know this book. It's a marvelous book called The Emissary, The Master and His Emissary, by this psychologist and sort of philosopher, I guess, Ian McGilchrist. But he's this was something I knew from my early days actually studying Homer and Greek, when I was doing my postgraduate work, that the Greeks talked about logos being basically the rational mind and the rational approach, and what we would think of as a sort of scientific rationalist empiricist approach. But they did not think that you should reject or ignore mythos, which was the path of mystery, of not knowing, of being open to the powers that are unseen, and so on. So, and Ian McGilchrist picks this up as basically somewhat left brain, right brain, the two hemispheres of the brain. And he said that when he went to Oxford to read English literature, and then sit there looking at a poem, trying to categorize it, in other words, not appreciate its uniqueness, trying to analyze it in a very intellectual way, in other words, not experiencing it, not allowing the poem to be an embodied experience, where really the body is the savorer of the poem, the receiver of the poem. And then he had a third point, which I'm now forgetting, but basically all three approaches that the sort of intellectual eye of Oxford shone on a poem were exactly the three wrong things that you do not want to be taking to a poem. And so he switched and studied, I think, psychology. But he's a very eminent academic now at this shrine of the ultimate sort of academic accolade in Oxford is to be at All Souls College. And he's there, and they're often actually it's often the fellows of All Souls are kind of so elevated and revered that they don't even write books usually. That's beyond books, and there's got to be good at conversation at the college dinner table. And Isaiah Berlin was this famous. I don't know. I could go off on a red herring there, but anyway, but he actually has written. Ian McGilchrist has written this marvelous book, The Master and His Emissary, and a follow-up to it that's enormous. I haven't read it yet, but yeah, I think my feeling is that there's a lot of modern mindfulness is sort of quite dry. It's you've got to just do this thing, follow your breath, think of it as going to the gym, and doing your breath reps. And I think that is just leaving out so much, and so I put in this whole section on support and connection to try to counteract that it's absolutely about enriching our life, and that's of course about human connection, but it's also about connection with the world and connection with, it may be more unseen forms of connection in dreamwork and in shamanism. I've done some of, and just being more open to the sort of archetypal realm or the collective unconscious, and of course the imagination again, that you mentioned earlier, and that whole world basically of the soul. That Wordsworth is the master, the great apologist for, and has spoken about it so wonderfully in a way that is still so relevant. And and it just struck me that meditation is so much more than a dry method to be part of a mental health regime, and I just wanted to really put that out there, that hey, much more to it than that, and let's not forget the soul.
Yeah. Hear him. Yeah. Can we have you just take a little break and read a couple of your poems?
Yeah, I'd love to. Sure.
Now, you sent me a couple poems, and then Frosty Morning, and I just love you to read what poems you'd like to read. And then there's also Frozen Lake, um, and then Archangel Birches, 2007. I kind of like that because you wrote a 1,200-page novel about your family, right?
Yeah, I did, and it was actually, I think it might even have been a bit longer, actually. and and I ended up, and I had this whole, the whole plan for it and everything, and I ended up with a little sequence of poems, actually, that are in that book, Archangel. And I went to, but it was the story was about my grandfather and his brother, who so I'm seeing how succinct I can tell it, but basically they were Jewish refugees in the early 20th century who moved to London. If they wanted to go to New York, but they didn't have the money, they stopped in London and settled there. But just 4 years after they'd arrived, they were sent back to Russia, along with about 5,000 young Jewish men, to fight in the Tsar's army on the Eastern Front against the Germans in the First World War. There's a whole backstory as to why that happened, but they were shipped out to Archangel, and they arrived 3 weeks before the revolution in October 1917, the Russian Revolution. At which point Russia pulled out of the First World War, because it was an aristocrats' war in which proletarians were being sent to the front line to be killed. So they pulled out of the war, and all these 5,000 Jews who'd actually emigrated to the UK, were suddenly back in Russia, and they were all given rail passes, all Russia rail passes, because the authorities just were in chaos and there's no way they could cope with them all. So my granddad and his great uncle, and neither of whom I ever met, they died before I was born, tried to slowly make their way back to their native village in Poland, and actually then on in the Ukraine, where they'd come from, 4 years earlier. And basically, but they really wanted to get back to London, where they'd left young wives with kids, and it took them 4 years, and finally they got to Constantinople, and from there they got a boat to Marseille, and from Marseille they got to Paris, and they got back to London 4 years later. So I'd written this book about that and subsequent generations, a great sort of family chronicle. But man, it was a mess. It was a really big mess, 1,500 pages or so of mess. I'm still hoping one day to get back to it and tidy it up or figure it out. But along the way, I got sent to Archangel by a magazine to write an article about all this, the magazine Granter, and I sort of, the harvest was a little sequence of poems that I think is probably the best telling of that story that I'll ever have. And one of these poems, Archangel Birches, is just about a moment in that sort of search for traces of their time in the city of Archangel. And so this is Archangel Birches. The black Russian birch trees only turn silver 40 feet up, where their italic trunks arc into the rain-like gauze of their trembling world of leaf. A line of them, 200 years old at least, set to outlive us all, shedding late evening dusk. My ancestors would have known that mid-September in 1917, when they left the ship in a wind cold off the Dvina. That's all I find between the trees and the docks, a deep tank of birch light, a green gloom lit with stars, and the swaying proof they once walked through it.
It's really, really stark, and it's really great to have that backstory where, everything is just this small little poem. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about Frozen Lake?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I think I know that one by heart, actually. Let's see. Frozen Lake. It has a little epigraph, which is from that Sufi poet Sheikh Abu Sa'id, who called himself Nobody, Son of Nobody. He says, Allah says the broken ones are my beloved. So this is Frozen Lake. When I think of friends who've been through the worst, through the dread love lives with, through the terrible fear anxiety can only dream of, I feel sorry for the rest who had it all as they'd hoped, who crossed the frozen lake from one side to the other, never guessing the great dark beneath. But those for whom the lake cracked and opened, who fell into its unspeakable night while still walking upright in the light of this world, whose hearts burst and met its waters. For them, there is no consolation, nor is any needed.
I love that line. For them, there's no consolation, nor is any needed. Yeah. Quite an image, falling through the lake. Well, I have a couple poems I really like, and I like Farmer's poem. I like Wistable. But what I'd like to do, I think, is open it up for John Tarrant right now to ask him to come in, and then we'll have a Q&A, and hopefully we'll have more time for poems at the end. John Tarrant, do you have any thoughts or questions?
Yeah. Those poems are so fabulous, and they're sort of not quite like American poems, and in a way that sort of maybe Bill Merwin's poems a little bit sometimes, but and I was sort of really struck by how much they move, or maybe they're more like European poems, really, even than English poems. And I don't know why I'm saying that, but thank you.
Yeah. No, I think I can sort of I can feel what you're saying. I think even yeah, even the world of British poetry is, of course, it's a multifarious thing, but I did feel I was somehow the music I was trying to find, even when I was busy as a UK poet, was a little different from what most people were doing at that time, who were the busy poets and the active poets in the UK then.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, there's something, and I think this relates to Zen. There's something about listening for what you didn't know was, you had a hint that's there, but you didn't know was there, and not sort of throttling it and making it improve you, and which is, I think, your objection to the way mindfulness is taught often, and certainly mine. But there's something, I think a lot of Zen is how to move with those things that you barely know about, but you know are the most real thing. And I guess your Arctic, your rather terrifying Arctic poem is about that. Could you say anything about that? Not about having to move with
yeah.
the stuff you don't really know is there, but you know it's more important than all the clever things you could do and stuff.
Yeah, and I think also it's, the basically heartbreak, how to, when heartbreaking things happen that are beyond what we can bear, what is called forth, and how those can become thresholds into a much greater intimacy with life than we'd known before. And I think it relate. There's a certain kind of breaking that seems to happen in koan work. That the predicament that you can't resolve. And that's actually the path. Or it's not really. Perhaps it's not really a path, but that's the way. The predicament, as we were talking about earlier, which I think it's right on. And something breaks, and it's analogous to heartbreak. A heartbreak can be very opening. Not that we wish it on anybody, but it can be. And I feel that there's that it's analogous to koan work, where the shin is being, where the heart mind is being addressed, and it's not just what the mind thinks it is. And but the mind will never get there. The mind has to break in some way for the greater reality to show, to be lived. So that poem was really came out of heartbreak, that I knew and that people close to me knew. And it just sometimes I find there's lines that I don't may not be 100% quite sure what they're saying, but I know they're right.
Yeah, yeah.
And I try to trust that.
I think the path is like that. That we have this nice plan, whatever, for the path, but we don't really, and we don't know what it's going to do something with us. It's not going to be subject to what we want, because it can't be, because the person who wants that is not the person who's going to walk the path and arrive and all those things. So I like that, and I feel like your work has a lot of sense of that. And I have a curiosity. This is none of my business really, but is that going to stop me asking? No. So, um, but it's a prior apologia. But I thought it was interesting that what happened neurologically? How could you not do Doxone? How can you say? I can understand why you might not want to or something, but if you see what I mean.
Yeah. No, it was actually a physical thing. I had a concussion, and it led to a long tail of post-concussion. And one of the symptoms was that if I if I if I looked intently into another face, I'd just get dizzy, and my brain just couldn't do it. I don't know what part of the system it was, but yeah, it was. And so if there was a a Dokusan line, of 12 people or something. Yeah, it was impossible. And so that really was a symptom of the concussion I'd had that endured for quite a while. But it
So
was
I think I mean, I get that. I've had concussion, and so keep going. Sorry, I interrupted you.
no. I was just to say that I think actually I was also somewhat cognitively impaired. I mean, I was sort of okay, but I wasn't. I would get befuddled quite easily, And I mean, that was nothing new, but it was the dial was turned up on it, And I started. I mean, I really felt that I just started to live in my heart much more.
Yeah.
And I didn't miss the old head, really. I didn't really miss it, and that this book also came out of that. I hadn't expected to write it, but I was early on in COVID. I was up in a cabin of some friends up in the mountains in northern New Mexico, and I was just going to be there alone, resting. I'd been teaching a lot. I wanted to take some time off and hike and just bask and get in the river and things. And the first morning, a phrase came and I had to write it down. And 12 days later, I'd written the first draft of the book. It
Nice.
came in a rush of dictation, But it was all
so
about.
I guess I'm pointing to. I'd like you to finish that, but I guess I'm pointing to. Well, what if the heart was the important thing anyway? I mean, it's nice to be smart, and Zen is full of A students who sort of, in some way, are trying to use that, but not really, but escape from it too. So,
That's exactly what I feel. Is that the heart is what matters, and really, this whole book, Original Love, is a paean to that.
Yeah, and I don't know that I can't. I mean, occasionally I take drugs for medical reasons that really mean my short-term memory is not that good. Well, people would say, how would they know the difference? Because I'm a bit spacey anyway. But it's true. And then I realize, I have to be with people in a different way. It's true. The way I can be with people is feels very true. But and perhaps even superior, which is I think what you're saying. And so I'm not saying you should do this or anything, but I'm interested in, well, what if I just do it that way, and if my memory keeps me on a need-to-know basis, does that matter?
Yeah. Well, that's basically what happened for me. I could do it no other way. I mean, it's as my concussion symptoms have improved over the last year or two, maybe it's changed a bit, but for a chunk of time, 3 years or so, I was just living in my heart, and it's alive. It's so.
That's what I mean. I read again, but I read the whole thing is so moving to me about how you went away, far, far away, and your symptoms disappeared, and just such empathy for that poor kid who's there, and all the stress of the family is going through you, and you're keeping people alive in a way to look at it.
Yeah.
And then you go away, and it's such a relief for you. And I was raised in a far place in Tasmania, which is a far colonial place, and everybody wanted to get to England and be tormented with eczema, but and it was it had its own kind of oppression. And I remember I was getting terrible migraines, and then I just had the thought, I just need to leave. And I did, and my migraines disappeared, and all the medical reasons disappeared, and things like that. So I think there's a kind of cunning in the way the Dharma reels us in with those kind of things, sort of.
Yes.
That we get sensitive to the unconscious quality of the moves we make, and the moves that life makes with our bodies and those kind of things.
Yes, exactly. And it's really these are we prepared to heed the call? Are we prepared to receive the nudge and that comes from who knows where? And that and I feel lucky that at times somehow I have been able to do that. But because we can never know where it to what we're being called, because it is precisely what we don't know. It's always into a greater. It's always into what we don't yet know.
Right.
There's again and again, and it's how willing am I to go into what I don't yet know, and to trust that the thing that seems often like the hardest thing to do is actually the thing to do.
Yeah, like in your situation with your poor family and poor you, is that the hardest thing actually was to stay there. I mean, that's the way it is when and
Yeah,
it's kind of, but it's also part of the alchemical fire that torments us and burns us, and
absolutely.
it's just what spirituality comes from.
Yes, I totally agree. And when we sit still, it's harder to escape the fire.
Yeah,
No, I'm sure that's a big part of what's going on in Zazen. Yeah.
Yeah, it was for me, but I don't know why it just suddenly. I think a lot of. I mean, I think you're pointing out a lot of them because our conscious motives and conscious directions they're not quite get us where the Dharma is taking us. So we often don't know why or what we're doing. We're just putting. And there's that Yunmen's darkness about what if there's no light and know where you've been, how will you move, and so I really like the way you're resting in that and talking about that, and sort of nice.
Yeah, I think there's a way that when we're living in the heart, somehow we've got more fluidity or more navigability. We can respond more responsively to the promptings of the Dharma. I think because we're not so concerned with what we know.
Yeah,
The heart dissolves all that.
Well, and Collins point that out, like if you can't talk, you can raise a finger or something like that. And yeah, you can't raise a finger, you can raise a leg. So,
Yes.
yeah, the reason I like in the well, you're in the United States. In California, the whole mindfulness thing has either become corporate, uh, and some of my friends did that for us, but is it or a kind of self-help thing where it'll calm you down and things like that, but it's still the you being calmed down and so on. And I guess I don't know much about jhana practice, but although I've had those states, of course, anybody who's done a session has had states, but and I suppose there's some way you get out of your you. Is that right, or what?
Yes, I think so. You get you pop into these quite magical kind of. It's almost like being in a sort of illuminated chamber or something but you're not really separate from it. You're sort of both sensing it and observing it, but it's also somehow part of you, and they're very beautiful. And I think they are they view, well, some jhana teachers view them as sort of ladder to awakening, and some think they are already awakening. In my experience, they're marvelous, but they're nothing like Kensho. There's no engineering Kensho. It's
Right.
and you might you can sort of sometimes get a glimpse of something boundless. You can in jhana, and there's different flavors of that, and it's very, 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 very beautiful. But it's not the same as a real realization about what this whole thing has been all along,
Yeah, I think that some of the old teachers in those traditions talk about neighborhood states, and that you go Kensho, or which they don't call it that, but you need, if you're in a neighborhood state, you can sort of, I don't know, go next door to borrow the sugar or something. But
Yeah.
so I don't know, but it does seem that
But I mean, sorry, can I, if I
yeah,
could just jump in on what you're saying about the mindfulness thing, and I mean, I think the key thing, I think, is exactly what you're saying, really, that it's so much about what can it do for me in my general regime.
right,
I want it to be a component in my regime. Now, but personally, I have been quite against that in my early years of Zen teaching.
yeah.
But now I'm more sympathetic, because I think anything that people need that meditation can help them with, great. But it's just that I feel it's really important to know that that's not the end of the story. And a lot of modern mindfulness doesn't know that that's not the end of the story. They think that that's what meditation is for. So
Right.
that's another sort of, I suppose, agenda I had for this book, Original Love, by laying out what these different possibilities are. I'm saying, these things are really good, but they're not the same as
When
realization.
somebody's got a thing up here going, it's kind of touching, actually, saying, thank you very much. And I've been using your app, but I haven't had Kensho, which is so weird, right? That's the, and I haven't entered those states. So, and so there's a certain way in which you can't do cons in order to get X, and in a way, learning that is a wonderful thing. And then, I don't know, you tiptoe around and then suddenly you fall into something, fall into the abyss or something. But
Yeah,
the Arctic thing, you have to keep sort of in a way leaning into it, but you can't just get it by, I want it and I'm going to do these right things.
exactly. There are certain things that you can probably get from meditation practice in the realm of mindfulness, possibly in the realm of jhana and so on, but not realization.
Yeah.
Not awakening. It's I mean, but then again, I mean, I've been much more curious about other traditions in the last 5 years as well, and I've got friends who are in Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, quote unquote, and they do have more, and some Tibetan Dzogchen practice as well, that they are more, they call them pointing practices or pointing out practices.
That's what they think. When I teach at Dzogchen centers, they think I'm doing pointing up. Yeah.
Right.
And although I started out with deity yoga actually before Zen, but yeah, so I don't know. It's mysterious. I'm aware that I've been hogging your time, and probably we should let somebody else have a shot at you. But that's very interesting. And I come to Santa Fe occasionally. I might come to Santa Fe, so maybe if you're around, we might.
Oh yeah, I'd love to meet up. Yeah, that'd be terrific. Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you. It's very. I like there's a sort of dancing quality to your approach, and I like you're free, and you'll take this from there and that from somewhere else. And
yeah, I think I'm quite pragmatic. Whatever helps, but at the same time, I really appreciate what you're saying. That there is, to my mind, there is such a distinction between what we can do for ourselves,
yeah,
and what we can, and the lesson of really learning to sort of give up and surrender as well, and that sort of whatever that is that allows us to trust and surrender and yield, and to really, in a way, give up on our project, whatever our meditation project might be, to actually give up on it.
probably your being a poet helps in that way, but because you can't manufacture a poem really. But
the ones that you do never work.
Unless you're W.B. Yeats, who could write them down in prose and then put them in verse.
Yes, yeah.
Good
Well,
enough.
there's those ones there's no accounting for. Yeah.
But I think that the question of fate with how people get into a path, I think, is really important, and or just not important, but just is part of it. What you run into this person, I tell you something, and then you go away, and then suddenly make a phone call without intending anything, and like that sort of thing. So I think
Yes, I love that. That's the
Like the important thing, really.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Henry. Delightful to meet you and have a chat. So, and
Yeah.
John,
Likewise, you.
get us out of here, John.
Well, we've got a couple of questions perhaps from, Susan, I think I can see these. Thank you for teeing them up. For Henry, a non-dual awakening, aren't the structures and formalities of Zen irrelevant?
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I'd love to hear John's take on that as well. I would say they may not be in kind of bringing something like that forth. It may be that there's something about the structure and the rigor and the having submitted oneself to those protocols that may be relevant, and then after, it may also not be irrelevant to have structures like that on the path toward embodying and integrating. And actually, I mean, those words don't really do it justice, but getting to a point where we can actually be permeable enough to absorb what we've awakened to in more and more of our life and be guided by it. But it's true, of course, in the actual awakening, I mean, everything's irrelevant because suddenly that's the truth, and it's either infinite or it's absolutely nothing. There is the experience of there really nothing, no self, no world, but everything's being given out of that nothing, and yeah, in when you, I mean, it is true, I suppose, that all structures are irrelevant at that level. There aren't any anyway, and it doesn't really matter. When you really see it, it doesn't matter if you've got a structure or not, because the structure is just as much a part of what we're awakened to anyway. It's not like there's structure on one side and awakening over here. It's applicable without exception, if you see what I mean. So therefore structures can be helpful. And they can't be an impediment. In a certain way, nothing can be an impediment.
Another question. You've been talking about flow-like experiences more. Is there any more that you can say about flow-like experiences?
Well, I would just want to basically, put in a plea for them. I think it's very beautiful when, we've been sitting and it's been a slog, and the knees hurting and the hips aren't happy, and we've got some idea of what we're trying to do in a meditation, and whatever it might be, however ill-conceived in the first place anyway, but anyway, we're failing and we're getting frustrated and it's disappointing, and isn't meditation supposed to be a path to, isn't it supposed to be the gate of ease and joy, and it's nothing like ease and joy. It's marvelous that we might suddenly have a switch flip, and suddenly we're in a kind of abiding ease that feels like it's always been here, and how could we possibly have missed it, and if we're somewhat novice or maybe beyond, maybe we've been meditating quite a while, and we think, oh my gosh, this is fantastic, I want to stay here, please, and suddenly it's gone, or a week later, why won't that thing come back? That was so sweet. Why won't it come back? But actually, those states are sort of blessed, and I think they're worth appreciating. It's marvelous that we can find that kind of fulfillment and effortlessness and grace, really. Just in our very being, not by we're not having to do anything. We're not having to be a concert violinist or something to get there. It's just ordinary us in the midst of just being quiet and still. And often we might be having a rough time, and suddenly this thing opens up, that's really a balm, you know, and so assuaging to the human heart, a salve for the human heart. And it's come out of just not really doing anything. I think that's marvelous. That doesn't mean it's the same as, Kensho, but man, it's nice. So I'm trying to, that's another purpose of this book, is to really be making the plea for all these different dimensions of practice as beautiful, valuable, treasures really for us humans who are trying to find our way.
Yes. And then let me see, Henry, thank you for your talk. The I Live and books are getting away from the lure of the mind that you and John Tarrant were discussing really resonated with me. So thank you. What is your current practice these days, Henry? And then we'll take that last one.
I'll tell you, I mean, I don't know how interesting this is, but I mean, I basically, sometimes I just feel like I don't really have a practice. I just sit down and whatever happens, happens. And I'm happy to be sitting still. That's enough. And I think it's a very sort of faulty form of shikantaza is what I would claim, that I'm doing just sitting, shikantaza, just sitting, and anything goes. Sometimes I'll bring in a method because I like to, and that would be basically just being aware of whether I'm aware of inward sense experience, thoughts and feelings, namely thoughts and feelings, or are there none? And I'm hearing sounds and I'm feeling my body, and I just rest with whatever is arising. And often it gets very quiet and kind of attenuated, and I just I'm not looking for anything, really. I suppose I'd say I'm not really looking for anything. Sometimes sometimes I can see it's helpful to be just using some little bit of a method to just be a bit more aware and not lost in thought the whole time, but I'm really quite okay with whatever shows up, really, I think.
Final question from Ruben Habito, our good friend and teacher. What can you say to those who have sat for years trying and have not attained Kensho or Zensho?
Well, I would say, I mean, I don't want to be self-serving, but I think have a look at my book, Original Love, because it's all about these various folds of practice, that dimensions of practice that are immensely beautiful and valuable, and can really change in our lives and help us in beautiful ways that are not Kensho. So I think to have a rather exclusive emphasis on Kensho, I feel mixed about it. I think it's great that there are outfits that know about this thing. I mean, I wish I'd found it sooner when I was 19, and that thing happened to me. And it took me 10 years to get wind of any human organization that knew about it, in the form of Dogen then. And I wish I could have got oriented around it and understood it and helped around it sooner. So I think it's marvelous that we don't back off from it entirely, that we do speak for it and we don't shy away from that, and that organizations like Pacific Zen, are spokespeople for it, and that's fantastic. And because it is the most extraordinary, wonderful thing. I mean, maybe it's not really extraordinary, but it's the most wonderful thing. It overturns so much that seems so difficult in life, and of course we'll have a long journey beyond it to really let our lives be somehow, to be able to live from it more. But at the same time, it's really a shame if somebody spends a lot of years on a cushion trying for just one thing that can't really be tried for anyway, and it doesn't happen. And actually, all along, many other beautiful things have been happening, but they haven't been called out, so they can go unnoticed. And it just seems to me it's sort of wrong to not be aware of all these other dimensions of growth that a path of practice can help with so much.
Great. We have time for one poem. Do you have Farmer's poem in front of you?
Yeah, I can pull it up on the flash.
Yeah, I love that poem.
I've just got to find it in the book. Oh, I got it. One sec, I'm going to turn on a light here.
Sure.
Night has fallen here in Santa Fe as we've been speaking. Okay, Farmer's poem. I used to write poems, said the farmer, at his stall of small, sweet turnips. But 10 years back, I lost my son. I waited for him to go on. His hazel eyes roamed the resonant hall of the market, the big windows steamy from the shuffling crowd, silver with drizzle outside, then came to rest on mine. His hazel eyes roamed the hall of the market, then came to rest on mine. Clear, with a river depth under their surface shine. With stiff, swollen fingers, he brushed the dirt off a turnip and asked, "How many?"
Thank you. It's yeah. So, Henry Shukman, thank you so much for coming, and thank all of you for coming, and including some teachers and poets. Chase Twitchell is here, and Ruben Habito, former luminaries and old friends, and David Hinton, I believe, is here, and others who I'm not recognizing. Forgive me, but it was wonderful to have you, and wonderful to have you, Henry.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great honor and a real joy to get this time with you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming on.
Indeed.
And Susan, great to see you. Susan Pollack. We were together last weekend, actually, in Cambridge. Had a really wonderful, rich time there. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you for helping, Susan, as always. Yeah. Okay. Good night, all.